Chapter 16 Witching Winter. Ariel. It may have started out as a disaster, but the detour was actually turning into a bit of an adventure. At first, Ariel had been cursing Norbert the entire trek from the forest to Woodstown, but her anger had faded since. Norbert had set off hunting soon after they landed, while Ariel had simply been too exhausted to climb back onto her back. It wasn't before Norbert had flown off that Ariel jerkily recalled how long a dragon could hunt. Norbert's longest hunt to date had lasted 5 days. Unchained dragons could forage and search land and sea for prey until they had their fill, but then they could sometimes go even longer without needing to feed again. The plan was to find shelter, rest up and fly back home as soon as Norbert returned. But then Ariel had met Kragan Stark. Well, she met a lot of new people, but Kragan he just wasn't what Ariel had expected. Though at first Kragan had been skeptical to her magic, and Ellard unsure if Ariel was truly the Witch of Dragonstone, so she proved both points on the walk to Castle Holmwood. Plucking a frozen pine cone off a tree, she aimed her wand. Ariel had wanted to impress, so she put some effort into her spellcasting. With a few transfigurations, she turned it into a wooden lantern in the shape of a hollow pine cone, and then set a bluebell fire burning in the center. She'd used the same spells the night before, though she'd put a lot more effort into making this one pretty. This is a bluebell pinecone lantern, Ariel named it, and held it up by the handle so the stunned watchers could see properly. It casts plenty of warmth and light, but does not burn. And to demonstrate, she stuck her hand into the middle of the fire. Don't! Several jerked forwards to stop Ariel from doing something so stupid as putting her hand into fire. An improved change from the Targaryens. See? She said, wiggling her hand in the tickling warm fire. It does no harm. It feels closer to a warm fog. Kragan took the lantern carefully before daring to try it himself. It's true, he marveled, and everyone wanted to try to put their hands into the fire. They were so fascinated they remained out in the cold for nearly half an hour more, before Kragan reluctantly made to return the lantern. Ariel shook her head. Keep it, she insisted. I heard you turned 6 and 10 a week ago, and I have imposed on your company unprepared. It is only a small gift, but it should hold its shape for at least for a fortnight. The pinecone remembers what it was, and with time the magic will fade and it will return to its true form. Until then, please enjoy the heat of the lantern and happy name day, my lord. Once Ariel finished her business with Lord Holmwood and Norbert still wasn't back by nightfall, Kragan had invited her to join him to Winterfell. As Norbert was more likely to find Ariel on the road than within some castle, she'd agreed. I've heard tales of your castle. It's rumored to rival the Red Keep in size. It's bigger, Kragan said confidently. That's what the Maester claims. Winterfell is not as tall, but built over a bigger footprint. However, Kragan's expression tightened. It wouldn't be just of me to bring you along without warning you of the situation. It won't encumber you, Lady Ariel, or I wouldn't have invited you. But things might be tense when we return to Winterfell. I've come of age now, so by law I am the Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, and yet my uncle still sits in my seat as regent. It is my duty to assist my people in winter, but this trip was no more than an errand and not half as dire as my uncle claimed it was. I suspect it was a move to get me out of Winterfell for my name day. You believe he's trying to? Ariel trailed off before she put her foot in her mouth, saying, Is he trying to usurp you? Aloud was perhaps jumping to conclusions and words one couldn't use lightly around here, especially with a great house Ariel knew as little about as the Starks. Do you think Bernard Stark feels entitled to keep his position as regent longer than is his due? She settled for. I hope I'm mistaken, Kragan grumbled. However, he's mentioned a few times that winter is a dangerous time to destabilize the northern rulership. That if it's a hard winter, even lords might die, and that his line is more secure than mine. It's true. He's got 3 sons to succeed him, but by law I am the Warden of the North and Winterfell is mine, Kragan declared, sounding so confident in a way Ariel nearly envied. Ariel did not think she'd ever been so sure of her place in life. though she also felt for him. If the Dursleys had ever known of her Gringotts vault and the small fortune left behind by her parents, they'd have emptied it before Ariel was even 2 years old. As soon as the thought crossed her mind, a horrible jolt coursed through her chest. What had happened to her money and belongings after Ariel disappeared? By now, was she declared dead back home, like her parents? Then what had happened to her vault? Was it the Dursleys by law now? She had no will, so it must have gone to her closest living relative, Aunt Petunia. The thought made her furious. Ariel had been left with next to nothing here, while they might be spending her inheritance on a new car and a summer house in Mallorca Uncle Vernon had always talked about. Then perhaps I can help jog your uncle's memory. Ariel looked up through her lashes. Dragons get even the most stubborn souls moving with haste. So maybe if you returned with one, your uncle would find the motivation to get his arse out of your seat faster. Startled, Cregan laughed deep in his belly, eyes crinkling. It made Ariel warmly happy, with a stranger's urge to hide while simultaneously feeling as if she should be standing 10 feet tall. Ellard looked across the room, bemused, and he'd set off for Winterfell early next morning. As lords, Cregan and Ellard were not the same breed of nobles as those back in the Crownlands. For one, she hadn't seen many nobles who'd share their table with small folk to hear news. Not outside of whorehouses. Both Ellard and Cregan had dark hair and grey eyes, but didn't look like each other. Ellard's curly hair was cut short, with a square face while his eyes were smaller and darker than Cregan's. Cregan's sark wasn't pretty the way Sir Carl was, or anywhere near as polished as the Targaryens or Velaryons. He had strong shoulders, yet a leaner build than Ellard, with wavy brown hair reaching past his shoulders kept back by a leather string. His face was long, with a slight hook on his nose, and pale grey eyes like a winter storm. For a 16-year-old, his voice was unexpectedly deep, and his tone often intimidated people. Ariel was used to facing dragons though, and Hagrid's looks were far more intimidating than most, so didn't have quite the same effect on her as others. He definitely made her nervous, but not in a bad way. Of course, the two Northern Lords were still nobles, Ariel noticed that, ordering people around and expecting deference. But they were a far more down-to-earth version of lordlings than she'd grown used to, as she automatically responded to it by relaxing. They just had a blunt, direct way about them, and practicality was far more valued than perfection. Cregan was very hands-on, his friend Ellard too, a refreshing change from what Ariel had grown familiar with amongst the royals, who got testy if their personal cupbearer wasn't there to pour their wine. There hasn't been an official announcement about whom Aegon will marry, though Sir Lenor thinks it'll be one of Lord Baratheon's daughters. They are closer in age than any of Jason Lannister's daughters. Ariel shared, riding alongside Cregan on the journey to Winterfell at the front of the party to melt the snow. It eased the way for the horses, and she'd gone the extra step and lit up their lanterns with bluebell flames. Normally it was impossible to use them on the road, but Ariel's magic wasn't restricted by lacking wax or too much jostling. It also helped calm down the more magic paranoid guards to see magic used in such a practical way as shoveling snow. They had been traveling for 3 days, but were actually making very good time, and most of it had been spent swapping stories. Cregan and Ellard had told a lot about life in the north and their respective castles, though both openly favoured Winterfell. Eventually, Ariel had started sharing news of her own. From the way they talked, it seemed Northmen rarely concerned themselves with the happenings in the south, but the royals were an exception. They were for many. House Targaryen has closer ties to the Baratheons than the Lannisters, Cregan mused. I believe Princess Rhaenys' mother was a Baratheon. Yes, Ariel agreed. Princess Rhaenys' grandsons have all inherited the Baratheon dark hair. At least that's what their parents insisted. Both of them, quite vehemently, and Ariel had no room to say otherwise. They didn't look like Lenor, but Ariel had never seen Harwin Strong, and they sure hadn't much looked like Larys Strong either, that creepy man back at King's Landing and their rumoured uncle. Their sister does not though. Princess Visenya favours her mother's colouring, but she makes the exact same expression as Prince Joffrey when laughing. I guess only time will tell how the next one will look. Maester Geraldis believes it shouldn't be more than a couple of moons before the princess gives birth again. Maybe less. I've lost track of how many there are, Ellard admitted. The Maesters record the royal family tree for each raven carrying a birth announcement, but there's been so many. How many children does the crown princess have? 4, and pregnant with her 5th, Ariel summarized. King Viserys also has 4 more, and Prince Daemon has 2, making House Targaryen 30 members in name, though that's without counting spouses or their unborn babe. What about you? Ellard asked, eyeing Hariel. Why aren't you at court vying for Prince Aegon's favor? You're a dragon rider and a ward of his sister. The remark was so thought-provoking, Hariel turned around in her saddle to give Ellard an incredulous look. Aegon? No. She shook her head, needing to make this perfectly clear. No, absolutely not. Ellard's smile turned positively wicked. Can it be you are so far north because you are running away? Yes, you seem uneasy with the suggestion alone. Why? Cregan asked, unknowingly opening a can of worms inside Hariel's head. Sure, Aegon could be very charming, with a boyish playfulness and a careless approach to his entitled station that was refreshing compared to his tightly composed family. So a lot of people overlooked the fact that he was not a very nice person underneath the smiles. There were circulating rumors of both rape and bastards, and she was inclined to believe it true. Hariel hadn't known it at the time, since she'd been busy settling in Dragonstone, but Baela had been angry when one of her personal maids back at Driftmark was changed soon after her mother's death. The maid was 15, pregnant, and the boy she birthed was silver-haired and purple-eyed. Some said it was Daemon who slept with the maid at his wife's funeral, but Hariel had never seen him look twice at the castle staff, and it didn't quite fit. Aegon, though? He'd been flirting with any female crossing his path at Driftmark, and this was far from the only tale like that. Aegon seemed to be leaving children in his wake without giving a shit about what became of them. And for Hariel, who grew up an unloved orphan desperately craving for her parents, that poked a very inflamed nerve. How could someone with so much wealth have so little to share? If Aegon just stopped drinking his precious Arbor Red, the most expensive wine possible, for a single week, and used the unspent coin on his rumored bastards instead, it'd probably be enough to feed and clothe several of them for a bloody year. It disgusted Hariel, and made her compare Aegon to his older sister who was also rumored to have illegitimate children. Many thought Aegon should be the heir to the Iron Throne because he'd been born with a penis, but Hariel could not fathom why anyone would want a ruler who couldn't even be bothered to look after his own kids. If that's how he treated his own blood, how would he treat everyone else? Regardless if Rhaenyra's children were legitimate or not, she raised each of them to the best of her ability and loved them unconditionally, proving she could at least look after the welfare of another human being than herself. A pretty crucial trait in a ruling monarch, whose main job was to, well, look after the welfare of other human beings. Hariel didn't even know for sure if it was true. It was only hushed rumors overheard. But it was hard to dismiss outright when it fit uncomfortably well with what she'd glimpsed of his behavior in the past. Hariel grimaced. I don't know Prince Aegon well, except he's a good flyer and enjoys his pleasures in excess. But if it's not a Lannister, Tully or Baratheon, there are other dragon riders who'd be more likely to marry him. Who might that be? Ellard asked. Prince Daemon's daughters, Hariel admitted. Not that she wanted Baela or Rhaena to be stuck with Aegon either, but it was just a fact that the twins would be suggested before Hariel, especially if Helena ended up betrothed to Jace. She'd done the political matchmaking game in her head already. Disregarding the great houses, if Jacaerys was betrothed to Helena, Baela would probably be betrothed to Lucerys instead, the future Lord of Driftmark, while Rhaena stood a good chance of being tied to Aegon. He was below Joffrey in the line of succession to the Iron Throne, but still the second child of the king, closer in age, and it'd give him his Valyrian bride, which had been the whole point of his and Helena's broken betrothal to begin with. Of course, that all depended on whether Damon ever showed at court again. Though he was very fond of his niece Rhaenyra, in a way Ariel desperately hoped she was reading too much into, it was no secret Damon disliked his nephews. Allowing such a match might be beyond him. Merlin, Ariel missed the days when she did not understand the twisted logic to the Targaryen marriages. But alas, she knew what they were after now. Wealth, armies, Valyrian blood, and dragons. And speaking of... "Is that a dragon?" the tall burly guard named Osric called, pointing to a dark shape in the clouds. It was. Ariel immediately jumped down from her borrowed horse. "Please get down from your mount and retreat. I'll be going forward to call on Norbert, but the horses will probably get spooked by her approach. They're not familiar with dragons." Cregan and Ellard heeded her advice, but there was a guard who hesitated. "We should ride away then." "Don't! You might get thrown off," Ariel snapped, pushing the reins of her own mount into Cregan's hands and set off running through the snow. It was slow, but it'd be better to gain as much distance between them before she called Norbert. She raised her wand in the air, shooting out red sparks that flew high. The shade in the clouds started circling, so Ariel did it again, and finally Norbert appeared. "Sister!" Norbert's hiss reached her ear just before the dragon nearly crashed into the ground. "Norbert?" Ariel asked, worried about her hard landing. However, she jumped right up again, and what followed had Ariel as shocked as the people behind her, but probably in a very different way. While the Northmen were left in a frightened fascination by their first true encounter with a dragon, Ariel struggled to understand what the hell Norbert was up to. "What are you doing?" Like a dog sniffing a trail, Norbert stuffed her nose into the ground, her spiked tail swishing high in the air, and walked forwards on her hind legs, scraping her chest along the ground and drilling her head into the snow. "The clouds fell out of the sky, and now they cover the ground." "Do you mean the snow?" Ariel asked. "Snow! Yes! So much snow!" Norbert enthused, snorting scalding hot air into the snow and making it melt over her head. "Make a den of clouds with me, sister! It keeps melting and melting!" Of all the times Norbert had to act like the juvenile she was, it had to be now. In front of Cregan, as she talked so big of how scary she could be. Tremble before her mighty dragon, Norbert the Snow Eater. If she got her tongue stuck on some icicle, Ariel might die of embarrassment. Ariel saw Winterfell for the first time from astride Norbert's back, and from her first glance knew Cregan had not exaggerated its size. Winterfell was not as tall as the Red Keep, but its footprint sprawled far wider. Hogwarts would have fit within a god's wood alone, and Winterfell Castle was built all the way around that little wood. While Cregan rode up to the great main gates to meet Bernard Stark and his sons, who'd thoughtfully showed up outside with quite a lot of armed guards for the return of the new Lord of Winterfell, Ariel made Norbert circle over the town-sized castle a couple times. Winterfell was a series of constructions over a village-sized area, defended all the way around by two massive walls of grey granite, with a wide moat between them. The outer wall was 80 feet high, and the inner wall 100 feet. There were a dozen courtyards, several towers, the Great Keep, the Glass Gardens, and Ariel was told the crypts underneath reached several levels into the earth and which, if Cregan spoke true, was larger than Winterfell itself. That was impossible for Ariel to picture, but if it was somehow true, she suddenly understood how some people had gotten lost in the crypts and never found their way back. It'd be a whole town of darkness, inhabited by nothing but earth, stone, bones, and ghosts. After she had an overview, she navigated Norbert to land a little behind the gates, and jumped off. Word showing up with a dragon had caused Bernard Stark to gather his men to protect the castle. "Do not roam too far, Norbert. If you keep close, we can build a snow den together later. Do you promise to do so?" "I promise," Norbert agreed happily, flapping her wings and looking around curiously. Ariel hoped she'd wait with digging snow caves just a little longer. First impressions could only be made once, and Norbert already screwed up with one stock. They were waiting for her when she reached the gate. "Uncle, may I introduce Lady Hariel Potter of Britain, rider of the dragon Norbert and ward of Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen," Cregan said, placing a hand on her back to pull her into the conversation. It was a gentle touch, and his hand lowered back to his side almost at once. But Hariel was left very aware of their height difference, how close he stood, and that she didn't mind. "Welcome, Lady Hariel," Bernard said, nodding curtly while his dark grey eyes swept between Hariel, his nephew, and Norbert. "Lord Bernard," Hariel said, mentally shaking the cobwebs away, glad the cold was an excellent excuse for apple-red cheeks. "These are my cousins," Cregan continued the introductions, pointing them out in turn. "Benjen, Brandon, and Ulrich." Benjen was the oldest, maybe 18 or 19, while Brandon was Aemon's age, and Ulrich was the same age as the twins. "We met in Woodstown," Cregan said, "and I invited her to join me back to see Winterfell for herself." Lord Bernard kept stoic, a tall bear of a man Hariel found impossible to read, though his sons were shifting uneasily. "I was very pleased to accept the invitation from the Warden of the North. My dragon Norbert is quite taken with all the snow of this country, so this was perfect," Hariel said, while using her best smile and ignoring the tight glances passing between the cousins. "Winterfell is magnificent, Lord Cregan. You told me, but I had to see it to believe it." "A bit like your dragon," Ellard said, sounding smug as he glanced back at Norbert. "Just wait till you see the dragon fire, Lord Bernard. Lady Hariel said she was willing to give a demonstration." "All in time. Let's settle in first," Cregan said. "We've been traveling for days, and as my name day passed while I was on the road, we should make amends. Tell Steward Tobin to prepare for a name day feast, Uncle." Bernard frowned. "It's winter." "Yes, I'm perfectly aware it's winter, Uncle. We've withstood its bitter bite to and from House Holmwood for an errand which you could have sorted out with some patience and a couple of ravens," Cregan said harshly. "Coming into my inheritance is a big event that should be appropriately celebrated. We also have an important guest, Uncle. Norbert is the first dragon to come north in decades, and Lady Hariel is a ward of House Targaryen. We will show her the same hospitality as was afforded to my father when he was in the capital 2 decades ago." Holy shit! Cregan had warned her, but it wasn't before now Hariel realized how dire this could get. It was suddenly very real. She was in the middle of a succession strife, and she might have been the one to offer Norbert as a game piece, but Hariel wasn't sure what she'd do if this got out of hand. If Bernard didn't yield control. Then what? There was a quiet standoff between nephew and uncle, before Bernard gave in. Hariel didn't think this would be it, but for now, at least in front of Hariel, and especially in full view of her dragon, no more would be said. One of the first places Hariel visited in Winterfell was the Maester's turret, to write a message to Hagrid. Cregan's invitation to see Winterfell aside, Norbert was still not in the mood to fly home either. Not that Hariel had tried hard to convince her otherwise. Hariel knew Hagrid was probably worried, but it's not as if Norbert's behavior was unheard of. The Targaryens like to keep the illusion of absolute control of their dragons, but it just wasn't true, or the chains would never have been necessary, and both Hariel and Hagrid had heard stories of a time or two when a rider was taking off for a trip, like Aemon's trips to Dragonstone, or when Sir Laenor had once left with sea smoke for a fortnight with no warning. Really, this detour was almost to be expected, and Hariel had never seen the North. Not to mention, wouldn't it be rude to turn down an invitation from the Warden of the North? "Thank you, Maester. I'll write the message right away," Hariel said when the man handed over a piece of parchment cut to the size for a raven message, an inkwell and a quill. "You can use my desk, Lady Hariel, and I'll send your missive with a raven down to White Harbor. They have a raven that can fly the last stretch to Dragonstone." "So we're so far north that one raven cannot fly the entire trip alone?" Hariel assumed. "Precisely. the Maester responded, fidgeting with the Valyrian link on his Maester's chain. Hariel had not been able to send a message from House Holmwood because their White Harbour raven was injured. As a great house, Winterfell had more ravens than their bannermen, the only exception being House Manderley. As a port city further south whose main income was trade, Hariel was not surprised House Manderley had ravens that could fly to Dragonstone, at least unless they were shot down, injured or badly trained, because the messenger birds used in Westeros were hardly post owls. The Maester of a castle cared for the ravens, and each bird was trained to fly to one destination alone, maybe two if it was a smart one. The birds could not carry a whole scroll either, so a message had to be confined to a small strip of parchment. The tinier she made her handwriting, the more she could fit, but rarely was it more than a handful of sentences. To Rubius Hagrid on Dragonstone. Norbert brought me north. I am safe at Winterfell as a guest of Lord Cregan Stark, Warden of the North. Lady Hariel Potter of Britain. Hariel kept to full names and titles to make it obvious who the letter was intended for, since the main issue with ravens was how impossible it was to keep the content private. The Maesters controlled them, so they read everything written between the houses. When this missive reached White Harbour, their Maester would open it to see it should be forwarded to Dragonstone, but might see fit to show it to Lord Manderley before sending it onwards. At Dragonstone, Maester Geraldis would probably show it to Rhaenyra, who would again might share it with anyone else who happened to be around, before eventually it be given to Hagrid. I see you've addressed Lord Cregan as Warden of the North, but Lord Bernard is still Regent, Lady Hariel. I'd suggest you correct it before sending this to Dragonstone, so as not to misinform your foster house. Hariel put on a confused frown, playing just a little dumb. Rarely did anyone notice. I'd rather not. Lord Cregan is the eldest son of the last Warden of the North. By the law set by House Targaryen and the Old Kings of Winter both, Cregan is the Warden of the North now that he has come of age. It is indisputable. If I was to write otherwise, the princess might think there was a succession crisis in one of the great houses, Maester, while I and Norbert are staying with them at that. But that's not the case, is it? Of course not, the Maester said, nodding quickly. I'll send this. May I accompany you? Hariel asked. Before I came to Westeros, I had a personal bird back home, and I sometimes joined Maester Geraldis when he sent ravens. Of course, but it will be cold, my lady. I'd be happy to escort you to your chambers, and I'll send this afterwards. Isn't the ravens right above his turret? It'd be a long detour for you. Why don't you just escort me to my rooms after you've sent the raven? As you wish, Lady Hariel. Hariel was given rooms in the Great Keep for her stay. It contained a private solar with a fireplace and directly connected to her bedchamber, though she wasn't sure what to spend her time on within there alone. They'd also become aware of her sparse clothing situation. Hariel had packed a spare dress in her backpack, as dragon riding could certainly call for it. Just going through clouds was akin to taking a very cold shower sometimes, though that left Hariel with only 2 changes of clothes, neither designed for northern winter. Which was how Hariel had met Cregan's grandmother, Lady Lysa Locke. Lady Hariel Potter, you wouldn't be related to House Potter in the Reach? Lady Lysa asked when Hariel was shown to the woman's rooms. Lysa Locke had been married to Bernard's father, Cregan's grandfather, and acted as a Lady of Winterfell, seeing as both her daughter-in-laws had died in childbed, and Cregan hadn't married yet. She was tall and in her 50s. Her grey hair was pulled back and dangled past her hip, with feline blue eyes and a round nose. No, I am not. The names have similar pronunciation, but I'm an immigrant to Westeros. I'm from an island named Britain, Hariel said, surprised the woman knew of that house. Even after being drilled in the houses for most of her life, Princess Rhaenyra had completely forgotten about it before the Maester reminded them there was a very minor house named Potter sworn to House Tyrell. Yes, I hear that. You talk in the back of your throat, all rolling and off. Mind your pronunciation, or some might mistake you for a wildling. Hariel hummed. I'm sure my dragon will quickly rectify any misunderstandings. I'm sure, Liza agreed, smiling wryly as there was a knock on the door. Enter, Lady Locke called, and a young girl around 12 with bouncy dark curls and big grey eyes stepped inside. Ah, there you are, Sarah. What did you bring for our guest? I found a couple options, Lady Liza, Sarah said, coming into the room carrying 2 dresses. She placed them side by side across the table where Liza was seated. These 2 belong to Lady Margaret, she said, and then added for Harry's benefit. Lord Bernard's late wife. Generous of my son to lend them. He loved her dearly, Liza mused. Though I must ask what sort of sovereign lady travels as sparsely as you. The sort who never intended to travel for more than a day, Harry answered. I changed my plans by coming here. Did you now? Liza said pleasantly, though her blue eyes were only growing sharper. For a dragon rider, the world becomes a lot more accessible. It'll take me only a day to fly home. What a coincidence you'd meet my grandson at Castle Holmwood, Liza said, sounding like she didn't think it was a coincidence at all. And did you have time to join him back to Winterfell? Abruptly, Harry didn't want to borrow anything from this woman. She knew what they were assuming, what everyone would presume. It was getting worse for each year, and now even talking to someone of the opposite gender in an empty hallway could get rumors started. It was why Harry couldn't truly make male friends without getting sly remarks. She even had to keep Jace and Luke at a distance, who were kids. But maybe the worst part was that this time Liza wasn't wrong to be suspicious. He's the Warden of the North, Harry said. Liza's eyes tightened, but until someone outright said otherwise, Harry would play dumb to the inner political struggle of House Stark. She couldn't help wonder where Liza stood on the matter though. Cregan was her grandson, but Bernard was her only living son. Turning down the invitation would have been an insult to House Stark, and at the time I was in a pinch. Norbert flew off to hunt, leaving me stranded. Harry met the woman's gaze stubbornly. Because so what if she liked Cregan? Was that a crime? After all the nagging about marriage and betrothals over the last year, was Harry now going to be admonished for taking a liking to someone appropriate too? Harry reached out and fiddled with the sleeves of the grey dress on the table. The texture was coarser and thicker than southern fabrics, with high necks and several heavy laces. They looked warm. These are beautiful gowns, and it's very generous of you to let me borrow them, but I'm finding Winterfell unexpectedly warm. I need to wash my attires, but the 2 I have will keep me warm enough while I'm inside, and my coat should suffice whenever I venture beyond the Great Keep. It's the hot springs that keeps it warm, Sarah piped up, flushing when Harry turned to her. What do you mean? Winterfell is built on hot springs, Liza said. The hot water moves through pipes in the walls, keeping the castle warm through winter. Oh, like hydronics. Liza and Sarah blinked at her, and Harry quickly continued, as they'd never have heard of the word before. It's a heating system where they'd put pipes in the floor with warm water circulating. It's not in the walls though. They warm the houses from the floor instead. My uncle back home, it doesn't matter. Harry waved it off. It's very comfortable here, and this was done all the way back when the castle was built. Winterfell was built in stages. The first keep came first, raised 8,000 years ago by Bran the Builder, and the Great Keep came sometime later, Sarah said. Harry smiled. We haven't been introduced. I'm Harry Potter. I'm Sarah, and it's an honor to meet a dragon rider, Lady Harriel. I saw Norbert flying above Winterfell before. She's also my bastard granddaughter, Liza said, not beating around the bush with a no-nonsense tone. Cregan's sister, Sarah Snow. I was not aware he had any siblings, but it's nice to meet you, Sarah. Winterfell is majestic from both ground and air. Didn't Cregan even mention his brother? Liza asked curiously. No, only his cousins. I haven't been introduced to his brother either, but then I've only been here a few hours. Oh no, you won't be meeting Jono. He caught a fever last winter and burned up from it, Liza said briskly. It just seems there's quite a few things Cregan has failed to mention. That's why I came here, to learn more of Winterfell and your house, Ariel said. Though talking of the dead can be a painful subject. Mostly I heard of his uncle and some annoyances over the errands he was made to run in this weather. Liza sighed, her shoulders tense, and changed the subject instead. Said I will bring the dresses to your chamber, Lady Harriel. They're not as decorative as your southern gowns, but they'll serve you far better during your stay. You'll need something to wear while your traveling attires are cleaned. And though the Great Keep never freezes, it's still winter. The warm walls will do their best to keep winter out, but already I feel the chill crawling in.